The microphone screeched with feedback as my new father-in-law stood up during the reception toasts, champagne flute trembling in his manicured hand. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward him expectantly, including my mother's, who sat at the family table in her carefully saved-for dress from JCPenney, beaming with pride because her daughter had just married into what she thought was a good family. Richard Pemberton cleared his throat and smiled that practiced smile he used at his law firm, the one that never reached his eyes, and I felt my stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. Well, I suppose we should thank Elena's mother for joining us tonight, despite the obvious cultural differences. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath from across the room, could see her face crumple in real time as 250 wedding guests processed what they'd just heard. My husband Marcus squeezed my hand under the table, but his grip felt weak, apologetic, like he'd known this was coming and had chosen to hope for the best instead of protecting the woman who'd raised me alone since I was 7. My name is Isadora Vega Pemberton now, though I still flinch a little when people use the hyphenated version. 6 months ago, I was just Isadora Vega, senior marketing coordinator at a mid-sized advertising firm in downtown Portland. The kind of person who kept emergency granola bars in her desk drawer and knew exactly how to fix the temperamental coffee machine when it inevitably broke down every Tuesday morning. My office was on the 15th floor with a partial view of the Willamette River, and I'd earned that window space through 3 years of staying late, covering for colleagues, and never saying no when clients needed last-minute campaign revisions. I wasn't the most creative person on the team, but I was reliable in a way that made my boss Janet comfortable giving me the accounts that required delicate handling: family restaurants, small medical practices, local nonprofits that needed their limited budgets stretched as far as possible. At home, I lived in a converted loft above my mother's bakery in southeast Portland, an arrangement that worked because we both valued our independence but understood the comfort of family nearby. Mom had bought the building 15 years earlier with money she'd saved working double shifts as a hospital custodian, transforming the ground floor into Corazon Dulce, a small Mexican bakery that specialized in tres leches cake and conchas that drew lines around the block every Saturday morning. I used to help her with the books on Sunday evenings, sitting at her kitchen table with spreadsheets and receipts, calculating profit margins and planning seasonal menu changes. Those quiet hours together felt like the most honest part of my week. If these kinds of family stories resonate with you, make sure you're subscribed. Some truths need to be told. I met Marcus at a networking event I didn't want to attend. Janet had insisted I go, saying it would be good for my career to mingle with potential clients from the legal community. The event was at the Nines Hotel downtown, all marble surfaces and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where they served wine in glasses that cost more than my monthly parking space. Marcus was different from the other lawyers there. He seemed genuinely interested when I explained what I did, asked thoughtful questions about brand identity and client relationships instead of just handing me his business card and moving on. When he offered to walk me to my car afterward, it felt natural, not like the aggressive networking I'd been bracing myself for all evening. We started dating slowly, meeting for coffee between his court appearances and my client presentations. He was thoughtful in small ways, remembering that I preferred tea to coffee, bringing me books by authors I'd mentioned liking, never making me feel rushed or pressured. When he finally met my mother 3 months in, he complimented her pan dulce and asked genuine questions about her process for making mole sauce from scratch. But I should have paid attention to how he acted when she wasn't around. The way he'd go quiet when I mentioned family dinner plans, or how he'd change the subject when I talked about my mother's business. I thought he was just shy, maybe overwhelmed by how close our relationship was compared to his more formal family dynamic. The first red flag was when he suggested we have the wedding reception at his parents' country club instead of the community center ballroom my mother and I had been planning. "It's more convenient for my family," he said, "and they've offered to pay for everything." I should have recognized that as the first step in erasing my preferences to accommodate his parents' comfort. But the offer felt generous, and my mother was excited about not having to worry about catering costs. The country club was everything I'd expected and dreaded. Rolling golf course views, crystal chandeliers in every room, staff members who spoke in hushed tones and seemed to glide rather than walk. During our venue tour, Marcus's mother Patricia had made subtle comments about the guest list, wondering aloud if some of my family members would feel comfortable in such an upscale setting, suggesting we might want to provide maps since the club was in a part of town my relatives probably hadn't visited before. I'd pushed back gently, explaining that my family wasn't intimidated by nice venues, that my uncle was a successful contractor and my cousin worked in hotel management. But Patricia had smiled that thin smile of wealthy women perfectly, the one that says they're listening without actually hearing, and continued planning the wedding as if my objections were charming but ultimately irrelevant. The morning of the wedding, Mom arrived early to help me get ready, carrying a small box wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a delicate gold necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, the woman who'd raised my mother after her own parents died in a car accident when she was 12. "It's not expensive," Mom said, fastening it around my neck, "but it's been in our family for 60 years. I want you to wear something that connects you to where you come from." I was still wearing that necklace when Richard stood up for his toast, still feeling its weight against my collarbone when he delivered his poison with a smile. The silence afterward stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds before Patricia started clapping politely, encouraging others to join in as if her husband had just delivered a heartfelt welcome instead of a deliberate humiliation. I watched my mother's face crumple, watched her hand shake as she reached for her water glass, watched her force a smile and nod as if she agreed that her presence at her daughter's wedding was somehow an act of charity she should be grateful for. The woman who'd worked 16-hour days to put me through college, who'd built a successful business from nothing, who'd raised me to believe I deserved respect and love, was being treated like an unwelcome guest at my own wedding. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and congratulations from guests who either hadn't understood the insult or were too polite to acknowledge it. Marcus kept apologizing under his breath, promising he'd talk to his father, insisting his family didn't mean anything by it. But I could see the relief in his posture, the way he relaxed once the moment had passed and everyone went back to eating overpriced chicken and making small talk. My mother left early, claiming she had to get back to the bakery for an early morning delivery. She hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes and whispered that she loved me and was proud of me, that I looked beautiful and deserved every happiness. But I could see the hurt she was trying to hide, the way she'd retreated into herself the way she always did when someone made her feel small. I spent my wedding night in a luxury hotel suite, staring at the ceiling while my new husband slept peacefully beside me, and thinking about every time my mother had sacrificed her own comfort for my happiness. The dance classes she'd worked extra shifts to afford, the college application fees she'd paid when money was tight, the way she'd celebrated every small success in my life like it was her own victory. At some point during those dark hours, I made a decision. I wasn't going to spend my marriage apologizing for my family or pretending their casual cruelty was acceptable. Richard Pemberton had made a calculation that night that humiliating my mother would put me in my place, establish the hierarchy he expected in his son's marriage. He'd miscalculated. I started paying attention. Not confronting, that would have just given them opportunities to gaslight me about their intentions. Instead, I watched. I listened. I took notes. During family dinners at their Westmoreland mansion, I noticed how Patricia would seat my mother at the far end of the table, how she'd serve smaller portions than everyone else, how she'd steer conversations toward topics my mother couldn't participate in. Private schools, European vacations, investment properties. When my mother would try to contribute something about her business or share a story about my childhood, Patricia would smile politely and then immediately redirect the conversation back to something more suitable. Richard was more direct in his dismissiveness. He'd interrupt my mother mid-sentence, correct her pronunciation of English words she'd been speaking perfectly for 30 years, and make jokes about Mexican culture that weren't quite offensive enough for me to call out without seeming oversensitive. When I tried to discuss it with Marcus, he'd sigh and explain that his parents were just old-fashioned, that they meant well, that I was being too sensitive. My first attempt at addressing it directly backfired spectacularly. I tried to have a calm conversation with Patricia about including my mother more in family gatherings, suggesting we alternate hosting duties so my mother could share her cooking and feel more comfortable. Patricia listened with that practiced sympathetic expression, nodded at appropriate moments, and then continued exactly as before while making sure to mention to Marcus how emotional I was becoming about family dynamics. That's when I realized this wasn't about cultural differences or social awkwardness. This was about power. They'd decided my mother wasn't worthy of basic respect, and they expected me to accept that judgment as the price of admission to their family. Every slight was calculated to remind both of us where we stood in their hierarchy. I needed to understand exactly how they'd built their wealth and status, what they valued most, and where they were vulnerable. Information gathering, the same skills I used at work when researching competitors or preparing for difficult client presentations. The opportunity came 6 months later, during Marcus's birthday celebration at the country club. I'd spent weeks preparing, researching, making phone calls to verify information I'd gathered from casual family conversations and social media posts. Richard had had too much whiskey and was holding court at the bar, regaling his golf buddies with stories about his latest legal victories and property investments. That's when I struck. I approached the group with my phone in hand, smiling broadly as if I had wonderful news to share. "Richard," I said loud enough for the entire bar area to hear, "I've been doing some research on our family history for a scrapbook project, and I discovered the most interesting things about your background." His face went pale, but he maintained his composure. "Oh, what kind of things?" he managed to say, clearly hoping I was talking about genealogy or military service. I kept my voice cheerful and conversational, as if I was sharing delightful family trivia. "Well, I found out that your father wasn't actually a founding partner of Pemberton and Associates like you've always told people. According to the state bar records, he was a junior associate who bought out his retiring boss's practice in 1978 using money borrowed against property he'd inherited from his wife's family. And speaking of that property, I discovered it was originally purchased in 1952 by your wife's grandfather using proceeds from a settlement with the city after they seized his previous land through eminent domain to build low-income housing." The silence around the bar was deafening. Richard's golf buddies were staring at him, waiting for his response, while he struggled to process how thoroughly I'd researched his family's carefully constructed mythology. But I wasn't finished. I'd also found out that the country club membership they were so proud of had been gifted to them by Patricia's brother when he moved to Florida, not earned through Richard's legal success, as they'd always implied. Every story they'd told about building their wealth through hard work and superior judgment was a comfortable fiction, designed to justify their sense of superiority over people like my mother. The fallout was immediate and devastating. By the next morning, Richard's golf buddies had shared the story with their wives, who shared it with their friends, who shared it with their book clubs and bridge groups. Within a week, half of the country club membership knew that the Pemberton family's origin story was carefully managed fiction. More importantly, I'd made copies of all the documentation I'd gathered and shared them with Marcus. Not vindicatively, but matter-of-factly, the way I'd present research findings to a client. "This is what I found," I told him. "This is who your parents really are versus who they pretend to be. You can decide what to do with that information." Marcus was quiet for a long time after reading through everything. Finally, he looked up at me and said, "I always wondered why they were so insecure about other people's backgrounds. People who are actually confident in their success don't need to put other people down to feel better about themselves." The next family dinner was different. Marcus sat beside his father during Richard's usual attempt to dominate the conversation and quietly fact-checked his stories in real time. When Richard made a dismissive comment about my mother's English, Marcus corrected him politely but firmly. When Patricia tried to exclude my mother from conversation, Marcus redirected questions to include her. I realized that my husband had never stood up to his parents because he'd never seen them clearly. He'd accepted their version of reality because challenging it would have required him to acknowledge how much of his identity was built on their lies. But once he understood who they really were, he couldn't pretend anymore. We moved out of the guest house behind their mansion 3 months later. Not in anger, but with clarity. Marcus started his own practice instead of joining his father's firm, specializing in immigration law and family reunification cases. We host family dinners now at our own table, where my mother sits in the place of honor and everyone listens when she speaks. Richard and Patricia still send birthday cards and holiday gifts, but the dynamic has shifted permanently. They know I see them clearly now, know that their superiority complex was always built on borrowed status and convenient omissions. They're more careful with their words, more conscious of their behavior, because they understand that respect has to be earned, not demanded. The wedding toast that was meant to put me in my place actually taught me something valuable about power. People who need to humiliate others to feel important are always more fragile than they appear. Their cruelty comes from fear that if they treat people as equals, others might discover they're not actually superior. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let people hide behind their carefully constructed lies. Truth has its own power.